The first message from my father wasn't an apology or a greeting. It was a number, a long one. Enough zeros to make my stomach tighten before I even understood what it meant. I stared at the screen while my coffee went cold. We hadn't spoken in years. Not after the last argument, not after the silence that followed. So seeing his name felt less like reconnecting and more like spotting a shadow move in a room you thought was empty. He followed it with a single line, "I don't have anyone else." That sentence did more damage than the number. It dragged up old reflexes I didn't know were still there. The urge to fix. To step in. To prove something, to him, maybe to myself. I didn't respond right away. I walked around my apartment instead, touching things like I needed proof they were real. The dented bookshelf. The cracked photo frame I never replaced. Ordinary stuff. Safe stuff. The kind of life you build when you decide not to need anyone. Another message came through. Not a demand. Not even a request. Just details. Deadlines. Consequences left unsaid but implied, like a door slowly closing. What bothered me most wasn't the debt itself. It was how calm he sounded. Like this wasn't a disaster, just a logistical problem waiting for the right person to solve it. I told myself I was only gathering information when I finally replied. Asked who he owed. How long it had been going on. What exactly would happen if it wasn't paid. He answered everything except the last question. That silence felt deliberate. Like he already knew the answer, and knew I would, too. When I say we hadn't spoken in years, people assume something dramatic happened. Screaming. Doors. A final line that couldn't be taken back. It wasn't like that. It was quieter. Worse, in a way. A slow erosion that made it hard to point to the exact moment things broke. My father was always good at survival. Not the noble kind. The adaptable kind. He could sense when a situation was turning against him and adjust just enough to land on his feet. Growing up, that meant moving a lot. New apartments. New opportunities. Promises that stayed promises. I left as soon as I could. Worked 2 jobs. Slept on couches. Learned how to budget down to the dollar because no one else would catch me if I fell. We kept in touch, technically. Holiday texts. Short calls. Updates stripped of emotion. Then even that faded, so his sudden reappearance didn't feel random. It felt timed. Like he'd waited until I was stable enough to be useful. I asked for documents. Statements. Anything that explained how a man who prided himself on staying ahead had managed to sink this deep. He sent photos instead of PDFs, cropped images. Corners missing. Numbers circled in red, like that made them clearer. He called that night. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Not weaker. Just worn smooth. He talked around the debt, not through it. Blamed bad partners. A deal that turned. People who vanished when things went south. I noticed how often he said we when he meant I. How he framed it as something that happened to him, not something he chose. When the call ended, I realized I hadn't said yes, I also hadn't said no. That space between those answers is where everything started to slide. I didn't agree to pay the debt all at once. That's what I tell people now, like it makes the outcome more reasonable. I framed it as help. Temporary. Controlled. A series of small decisions that felt harmless on their own. The first payment went out the next morning. Not the full amount, just enough to buy time, as he put it. I remember hovering over the confirmation screen, waiting for some internal alarm to go off. Something primal. It never did. Just a dull pressure behind my eyes. He thanked me. Not emotionally. Efficiently. Like we'd completed a transaction. After that, the calls became regular. Updates. Adjustments. New figures that slid into the conversation like they'd always been there. Each time, he reminded me this wasn't forever. Each time, I believed him a little less, but sent the money anyway. I told myself it was closure. That helping him would finally drain whatever influence he still had over me. That once this was done, I could walk away clean, what I didn't expect was how quickly he got comfortable. He stopped asking and started informing. Deadlines were no longer flexible. When I hesitated, he'd go quiet, let the pause stretch until I filled it with reassurance. My life shrank around the debt. I skipped plans. Delayed purchases. Watched my savings bleed away in neat, scheduled withdrawals. Friends noticed I was distracted. I told them work was stressful. That was easier than explaining why my father's mistakes were dictating my present. One night, after another call that left me staring at the wall long after it ended, I realized something unsettling. I was afraid to say no, not because of what would happen to him, because of what he would think of me if I did. That realization didn't stop me, it just made everything heavier. The paperwork never added up, and I knew it. I'd open the files he sent and feel that familiar itch at the back of my mind, the one that usually shows up right before something goes wrong. Dates overlapped. Amounts shifted by a few hundred here and there. Nothing blatant. Just enough to keep me recalculating. When I asked about it, he laughed. Not kindly. Not cruelly either. Like I was missing the point. You always did overthink things, he said. This isn't a spreadsheet problem. It's a timing problem. That line stuck with me. Mostly because it sounded rehearsed. Around the same time, he started sharing stories. Not about the debt, but about my childhood. Moments I'd forgotten. Times he'd protected me. Sacrifices he claimed I never saw. It felt strategic, like he was rebuilding a version of our relationship where I owed him something intangible and unmeasurable. Then came what felt like clarity. A late-night call where his voice dropped and stayed there. He admitted part of the debt wasn't strictly his. Said he'd taken a risk years ago, something meant to benefit both of us. A move he framed as paternal foresight, ruined by circumstances. I remember sitting on the floor, back against the couch, phone pressed to my ear. This explanation fit just well enough to quiet the noise in my head. If he'd done this for us, then maybe my help wasn't a rescue. Maybe it was a return. That became the story I told myself. The false revelation I clung to. That this debt was complicated, shared, born from some buried good intention. Once I believed that, the payments felt less like obligation and more like responsibility, and that belief cost me more than money. With that new story in place, everything shifted slightly. I stopped scrutinizing every number. Stopped pushing back as hard. If this mess was partly rooted in something he'd done for me, then questioning it felt ungrateful. That's how I justified it. Anyway, he leaned into that shift immediately. The calls grew longer, more casual. He'd ask about my job, then pivot smoothly into an update about our situation. Sometimes he'd sigh and say things like, "I hate that you're carrying this too," even though I was the only one actually paying. The language mattered. It blurred lines that were already thin. One night, after I told him I'd need to slow down the payments, he didn't argue. He told a story instead. About a man he knew who ignored a problem until it exploded. Lost everything. Family included. The moral was implied, not stated. I wired the money the next day. Still, doubt kept leaking through. I started keeping my own notes. Writing down amounts, dates, snippets of what he said. Not to confront him, just to ground myself. To have something solid. The more I wrote, the more I noticed patterns. Requests always came after I mentioned something good in my life. A bonus. A trip I was considering. It was like my stability triggered his emergencies. Then there was the letter, a physical one. No return address. Inside was a single-page notice from a collections agency. My father's name was there, but so was something else that made my chest tighten, a reference number that felt familiar. I didn't know why yet. Just that I'd seen it before. Somewhere I hadn't expected to see my father at all. That night, I didn't send the payment. For the first time since this started, I let the silence sit. The silence didn't last. It never does with him. He called the next morning, earlier than usual. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before, tight, controlled, like he was holding something back. He asked if everything was okay. I said I needed a day. He said deadlines don't pause for reflection. I brought up the letter. Casually. Like it was just another detail, he froze. Not audibly, but in the space between his words. When he finally spoke, he brushed it off as a clerical mix-up. Said agencies reuse templates. Reference numbers repeat. It was convincing in the way technical explanations often are, dense enough to discourage questions, but I didn't let it go. I asked where he'd first taken on the debt. What year? What account? He answered quickly, too quickly, like he'd memorized a version of events that didn't allow for detours. After the call, I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years. Old documents from my early 20s. Loan paperwork. Credit disclosures. Things I'd shoved away once they were paid off, or so I thought. That reference number was there, not identical at first glance. One digit off. Then I noticed the formatting. The spacing. A dash in the same place it had no business being. My hands shook as I compared them. I kept telling myself this was coincidence. That stress was making patterns where none existed. But the deeper I dug, the more uneasy I felt. There were gaps in my own records. Months I couldn't account for. A closed account I didn't remember opening. I didn't accuse him. Not yet. Instead, I did something I should have done from the beginning. I ran my own credit report. What I found didn't make sense. And worse, it didn't feel new. Seeing it laid out like that was surreal. Accounts I didn't recognize. Balances that should have been impossible at that point in my life. Addresses I'd never lived at, tied neatly to my name. My name. Not his. Not even adjacent. Just mine. The dates were old. Older than the debt he'd been talking about. Older than when I'd left home. I sat there refreshing the page, half expecting it to correct itself. Like a glitch that would disappear if I looked away long enough. It didn't. The numbers stayed. Quiet. Confident. I thought about confronting him immediately. About demanding an explanation. Instead, I replayed every conversation we'd had since he reached out. The careful phrasing. The way he never actually showed me original documents. How he always avoided specifics when I asked about origins, that shared risk he'd mentioned. The thing he'd supposedly done for both of us. I finally understood what he'd meant. He called that evening, frustrated that the payment hadn't gone through. I told him I needed clarity. Real clarity. That I'd found inconsistencies. That some of the debt appeared connected to me. There was a pause. Longer than any before. Then he said something that chilled me. Not a denial. Not anger. Just this quiet, almost weary admission. I knew this would come up eventually. He didn't explain further. Didn't apologize. He just asked what I wanted to do next. Like this was a joint problem-solving exercise. That's when it hit me. He hadn't been asking for help. He'd been collecting. Every payment I made wasn't saving him. It was covering something he'd never planned to take responsibility for in the first place, and I'd been doing it willingly. The betrayal didn't explode. It settled. Heavy and cold. I told him I needed time. He agreed, too easily. That night, I slept with the lights on. Time didn't bring clarity. It brought memories I'd never questioned before. I remembered signing things without reading them because he was standing over my shoulder, tapping the page, saying it was routine. I remembered him asking for my information just in case, back when I still lived at home and trusted that he wouldn't need it for the wrong reasons. I remembered how proud he'd sounded when I got my first credit card. How interested he'd been in the limit. None of it had felt dangerous then. It felt parental. Normal. I called the agency listed on the letter the next day. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked questions. Calm ones. The kind that don't trigger defenses. The person on the line confirmed the accounts were legally mine. Opened with valid identification. Payments made sporadically over the years. Sometimes from accounts not in my name. I asked if they'd ever spoken to me directly before. There was a pause. Then, we spoke with a family representative. That word sat wrong in my chest. When I told my father I'd contacted them, his tone shifted again. He stopped pretending this was about survival and started talking about consequences. Legal ones. Emotional ones. How messy things could get if certain truths were pushed too hard. He reminded me of how much I'd already paid. How close we were to being done. How walking away now would make all of that meaningless. For a moment, I felt the pull. The sunk cost. The temptation to finish what I hadn't started, just to end the discomfort. Then I realized something else. If I paid the rest, nothing would change, except I'd be confirming his version of reality over my own. I told him I was done sending money. That I needed space. That we'd talk later. He didn't argue, he just said, I hope you're ready for what comes next. So was I. Or at least, I needed to be. What came next wasn't immediate chaos. It was a quiet unraveling. The calls stopped. The messages dried up. In their place came mail addressed to me that I'd never seen before. Notices. Warnings phrased politely enough to feel threatening. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, like the weight of years finally landing where it belonged. I spoke to a lawyer. Then another. Each conversation peeled back a layer I hadn't known existed. Statutes. Limitations. The difference between responsibility and liability. Between what was fair and what could be proven. They asked if I wanted to pursue action against my father. I said I didn't know. That answer felt honest and cowardly at the same time. Part of me still wanted him to explain himself. To say there was a reason that made sense. Another part already knew there wasn't one that would matter. He reached out once, weeks later. A short message. Not an apology. More of a warning wrapped in nostalgia. He mentioned the sacrifices he'd made. The roof over my head. The years he'd spent protecting me from worse outcomes. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what I could. Disputes. Paper trails. Hours on hold. Small victories that felt enormous. Every corrected record was a reclaiming. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the grief. Not for the relationship we'd lost, but for the one I'd believed in long after it stopped being real. Some nights, I still draft replies in my head. Conversations where he finally understands. Where I'm not the bad son for drawing a line, but lines aren't punishments. They're definitions, and for the first time, I was defining myself without him. I don't know if this makes me the villain in his version of the story. I'm sure it does. In his mind, I imagine I'm ungrateful. Disloyal. The son who abandoned him when things got hard, but here's the part one still turn over at night. If I hadn't stepped in, the debt would have surfaced anyway. The truth would have come out, just with more damage and fewer options. By paying, I delayed that moment, and absorbed most of the impact myself. I kept things contained until I couldn't anymore. Was that loyalty? Or was it fear disguised as responsibility? There are days I wonder if setting boundaries earlier would have changed anything. If saying no at the first message would have forced honesty. Or if it would have just ended things faster, with less clarity and the same outcome. I've paid for the debt twice now. Once with money. Once with the relationship I thought I still had. People ask if I regret helping him. I never know how to answer. Regret implies a clean alternative. This didn't have one. What I do know is this: loyalty without boundaries doesn't make you noble. It makes you available, and availability, in the wrong hands, becomes permission. I'm still untangling what's mine to carry and what never was. Still correcting records. Still learning how to trust my own instincts again.